Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the seminar or speaker series in International Development Studies. We typically have 3 speakers each semester. That's fall and winter. And it's great to see so many people here today. Just a matter of interest, where are people from? Who's in ID per se? Who's students? Okay. So if you're not in ID, where are you from?
Latin America and Caribbean Studies.
Latin American Caribbean Studies. Where else?
Fair.
Fair, great.
Psychology.
Anthropology?
Psychology.
Psychology, okay.
Land agriculture.
Excellent.
Population medicine.
Very good. Is that it?
I'm the lone person from environmental sciences.
Welcome, God, Otis. Okay, well, nice that you're all here. I'm Sally Humphries, and I'm Director of International Development Studies. And today we have a talk, which I'm actually going to be involved in very briefly. Matt Little will primarily talk, and Cate Dewey, both of whom are in, well, Matt's a student in ID and population medicine, and Cate Dewey is a professor in population medicine. I'm just going to introduce a bit of background on Matt Little and how I came to work with him. So, back in 2008, a student showed up at my doorway asking if he could do a reading course with me. If you're a professor, this happens quite often. But in this case, it was one of those, I don't know if you read the novels by Ian McEwan. He's a British writer, and little instances lead to many, many knock-on effects. And I think this is a case of this in the relationship that I had with Matt Little. I didn't know who he was, but he wanted someone to supervise a course for him while he was on the Guatemala semester. That was going to be in, I think it was in winter 2009. And Matt was a third-year health science student, and my background, by the way, is sociology and a bit of anthropology. And Matt wanted to do something on medicinal plants, and he tried to find people who would supervise him in the area of anthropology, failed to do so, and landed at my doorstep. Anyway, I agreed to supervise Matt's work, and frankly was from the get-go blown away by this third-year student. He undertook ethics review and the protocol and the review more or less on his own. His initiative in the field was quite extraordinary, and the results that he obtained were also excellent. So apart from gathering data on medicinal plants, he ended up doing research at a rural clinic in Guatemala that served the Maya population. And it turned out that many people within that Maya population were suffering from type 2 diabetes. And his paper, which he subsequently wrote, looked at indigenous conceptions of health, the use of medicinal remedies, and particularly in the context of type 2 diabetes. And that paper was subsequently published in an undergrad journal called Undercurrents. Anyway, Matt and I kept in close touch after that, and because of his interest in indigenous health in particular, and type 2 diabetes, when he was considering going on, he actually thought about studying in anthropology and ID. In the end, he didn't, and with some urging from me, he looked at epidemiology. And combined with ID. And this was also true of another student, Warren Dodd. Both of them ended up taking at the same time doing epidemiology and international development. And one of the reasons that I suggested epidemiology is that Cate Dewey is in that department, and Cate has a strong interest in international development. It's hard to recommend that a student go and work with somebody outside of the College of Social Science unless they have this strong interest in international development, and Cate does. And that's why I suggested this particular relationship. Also, because both Matt and Warren were extraordinarily strong students. Matt was a merit scholar and Warren was a President's Scholar. Both of them were fast-tracked directly into the PhD when they applied, in fact, for a master's degree. Their background was strong enough to go straight into a PhD. At the time, I had research funding from something called a SIFSERV project, which stands for the Canadian International Food Security Research Fund, which was funded by IDRC, the International Development Research Centre, and CEDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, which is no more. It's now part of Foreign Affairs and Commerce. But that particular project gave me research funds, and the project focused on minor millets in South Asia and was managed by a former PhD student of mine, Kirit Patel. So I was in possession of a certain amount of research funding, which I was able to channel to both Warren Dodd and Matt Little. I should say that these students were both so strong that within 1 year or 2 years, they both had Vanier scholarships and IDRC scholarships. So all I had to do was provide seed funding to them, and they were away and had their own research money. So that was the sort of the knock-on effect that this chance meeting back in 2008 led to, and I say that the moral of this tale is when students knock at your door, invite them in. Do not send them on their way, because you never know when you're going to get a Matt Little. Anyway, so I'm going to hand over to Cate Dewey, who's going to talk more about the role of epidemiology in international development.
Thank you. Thank you, Sally, and it's my pleasure to be here today. I will echo what Sally says, that it really is an incredible pleasure for me to be able to work with Matt and Warren, and I do get great pleasure out of working with grad students, and they've certainly been a pleasure to work with. I won't take up too much of your time. I just have to say hi to David. Hi, David. I haven't seen you since you're back. Sorry about that. So what I wanted to do just in a few minutes was to tell you what epidemiology is, because I think it's important to understand what epidemiology is, and for you to understand why epidemiology and ID might work together. But first of all, I have a job for you to do. I would like you to tell the person beside you what health is. There's not a right or wrong answer here. All right, I'll bring you back now. I'm sure you could talk about this all day. Does anybody want to share with the group what you believe health is? Nobody. Guard, thank you.
It's a basic starting absence of disease.
Absolutely. Anything else?
Go beyond that.
Would you like to elaborate? One more person. Yes.
Well-being in all facets of the human experience.
Oh, I like that. That's awesome. So back in 1948, the World Health Organization said it was a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And my personal preference is to say that if I'm in a state of good health, I'm able to do the things that I aspire to. And that does include, am I in a social situation that I'm able to do those things? And part of that is that I'm lucky that I was born in Canada, and I'm able to do a lot of things that people who are born elsewhere aren't able to do. Sally said that I had an interest in work internationally, and I do, and I've been working in East Africa, particularly Kenya and Uganda, since 2006. And I'm not going to share with you the research project, but I will share with you what I was confronted by when I first went. So this is in Kenya. There were a lot of people who had died of AIDS. And so there were a lot of the middle generation missing. So we had a lot of grandparents and we had a lot of children. The middle generation was missing, and this grandmother, the woman who's dressed in green, said to me it's very difficult to do the farm work because she was old and she had arthritis. And it was very difficult to feed her grandchildren because it was hard for her to do that farm work. And these are people who are living in poverty on a smallholder farm. And you can see that young boy very proudly holding up a farm implement. Those children weren't going to school, they were doing the farm work, trying to feed the extended family. I'm a veterinarian, and my species of specialty is pigs. And Sally and I have had these discussions about, I said, but the pigs are hungry, and the opposite of that is the children are hungry. They're both hungry. And what's important about that is they eat the same food. Pigs have a stomach similar to ours, and they eat the same food that we eat. And so if you're in a situation where there's not much food, do you feed the pig or do you feed the children? And in their situation, they would let the pigs run free so that the pigs could find food to eat. We began the research work. I will just tell you that the person on the far right is Florence Matua. She's a veterinarian from Kenya. She had a master's degree in epidemiology when I met her, and she became my PhD student, the first of my graduate students to work there. But we began by doing focus groups with farmers and focus groups with extension officers to find out what the situation was with respect to pig farming in the area. Most pig farmers were women. And that's really important in this context, because if we were dealing with goats or cattle or sheep, they would be, at least the small ruminants would be cared for by the women, the cattle probably by boys or men, and when the ruminants are sold, the money goes to support the men. But pigs are a lesser animal in Canada as well as in Kenya, and the money much of the money would go to support the women and children when the pigs were sold. Oftentimes the decision to sell the pig is the woman's decision, and pigs are bought when there's a little extra money, and then they're sold when the family needs to pay for school fees, for food in between harvests, for medicine, for hospital fees. So it really is sort of a walking bank. When you need the money from that pig, you sell it, and then you've got the money for those emergencies. They had lots of challenges, but one of the main challenges was they didn't know how to feed the pigs. What I mean by that is they couldn't afford to buy commercial pig feed. They often let the pig roam to find feed, and they weren't really sure what a pig was supposed to eat. I shouldn't say all of them weren't sure, but some of them weren't sure what a pig should eat. One of their biggest problems was that they didn't know how to estimate the weight of the pig, so when the pig was sold, they felt that they weren't getting enough money for their pig. And when they let the pig roam, their neighbors complained. The pigs went into their gardens and dug up their food, and then oftentimes the neighbors would kill their pig. So you can see that we've got this complex problem with raising pigs, even though it gives wonderful assets to the farm. One of the reasons that I went there is because there's a tapeworm that pigs carry, the larval form of the tapeworm, and if people eat contaminated pork, they get the tapeworm, and through the life cycle, they ultimately can develop epilepsy from this tapeworm. Epilepsy in this community is seen as something that's brought on by the devil. Sometimes people will sell all that they own in order to take a family member to the doctor to get a diagnosis for this epilepsy, to buy some medication for the epilepsy. They'll treat the family member, and as we know, people with epilepsy often still have seizures when they take medication. As soon as the person had a seizure when they're on the medication, the people would say, well, the medication doesn't work, and so they would discontinue using the medication. This was a shameful thing to have, and so oftentimes these people were kept home. They weren't allowed to go to school, they weren't allowed to marry, they weren't allowed to have a job, and they had a very short lifespan because of untreated epilepsy. And so one of the reasons that I went there was to see what we could do about reducing the chance of epilepsy in the community and teach people about how to prevent it. So, I'm just going to leave you with that background. I'm not going to tell you what we did or how we did it, because this is really about Matt's work. But I wanted you to hear that, because if you put on your ID hat, you probably have a lot of ideas of how you might approach that problem. And now I would like to talk to you about what epidemiology is. I'm going to read this. It's the systematic study and characterization of the frequency, distribution, and determinants of health in populations. Some definitions will say health and disease in populations, and I purposely took the disease out, because if we have this more holistic approach to what health is, it doesn't have to be restricted to disease. It's broader than that. It is a scientific discipline. It is predominantly data-driven. And although we don't prove causation, we use causal reasoning, so we understand determinants of health. If you look on the Center for Disease Control website from the USDA, they'll say that epidemiology is an integral component of public health, providing the foundation for directing practical and appropriate public health decisions. And if we broaden that out, we then can say that epidemiology can be used to determine appropriate policies for an area given that from our research findings. We typically use observational studies in epidemiology. That's our prime thing to do, which basically just means we go to measure what's happening. We do key informant interviews, we do focus groups, we do extensive surveys, we gather data on people, we gather data on animals if we're veterinarians as epidemiologists, and we put that together to try to understand the determinants of health or lack of health. We use both qualitative and quantitative methods, and we gather information from other sources such as biostatistics. So we do a lot of statistics, biostatistics, but we don't necessarily develop the statistical methods. We let the statisticians do that, and then we abscond with what they've learned. More recently, we have been talking about ecosystem approaches to health. Now, not every epidemiologist uses ecosystem approaches to health, but I think that it's important to look at that to say, well, what does that really mean from an ID perspective? And so this is my definition of ecosystem approaches to health, and there's lots of definitions out there, but this is the one that works for me as a practitioner. So it's methods used to understand and promote health of people, animals, and the environment, and that interconnectedness of that all. But I think what's really important, and important maybe particularly with respect to talking to an ID audience, is that we're also incorporating social and ecological context, underscored by the perspectives of all the people in the community. So when we did our work, we were talking to pig farmers, but we were talking to people who ate pork, and we were talking to the extension officers and the people, the pig butchermen who bought the pork too. So it's very important in this approach to include everybody in the community. And I know in ID you talk about in understanding the people in the community. This is a picture of me doing a training of the trainers workshop to help facilitate training the farmers and giving back the results of the research after we'd completed our work. So that's a snapshot of epidemiology, and it's time to listen to Matt. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. All right, thanks for everyone for coming out on this Friday afternoon. I'm pretty happy to see such a large crowd. Thank you to Craig for for organizing and inviting me to speak to you today. And thanks to Sally and Cate for the flattering introduction, and Cate for the introducing us all to epidemiology. My name is Matthew Little. I'm a PhD candidate in the collaborative doctoral program between International Development Studies and Population Medicine. So I have a supervisor from each of those areas of interest. Clearly Sally is the international development expert and Cate is the epidemiologist. And so I have knowledge and methods from both of those disciplines underlying all of the work that I do. I'm going to be talking today mainly about my research in rural India, and I look at nutrition, chronic diseases, and shifting livelihoods over there. So that's what we're going to be talking about mainly today. Just to outline what I'll be talking about, first I want to delve into the importance of cross-disciplinary research and talk about exactly what that means. What does it mean when we try to take knowledge and information and methods from two different disciplines and actually combine them into something cohesive? And then talk about one specific study that I did in India. There was a cross-sectional epidemiological study looking at type 2 diabetes in this one quite small rural area of South India. So I'll go into the research problem in the background, the methods and the results, and I'm going to bring it back to the whole cross-disciplinary idea and talk about what international development theory can contribute to the project that I did. And in particular, I kind of give you a teaser there of what the answer is to that. It can contribute nuance and qualitative context as well as add vigor and overall kind of context to the problem that we're trying to look at. Afterwards, we're going to conclude and have some questions. So I want to begin by taking a step away from my own research and taking the spotlight off of what I do and looking at what cross-disciplinary research actually is. So first we have to define what a discipline is. And this is a term that we use often in the academic world to describe our field of research. But it's interesting to go back and actually look at the nomenclature, look at where this term came from. It came from the Latin disciple or disciplis, which is the training of scholars and subordinates of proper conduct and action by instructing and exercising them in the same. Eventually this was introduced into the English language as a system of rules of conduct or the order maintained among persons under control or command or punishment for not abiding by the rules. And I think it's really interesting that this is kind of underlies the common academic term for discipline, because this really emphasizes this idea that there is an entrenched set of rules, there is punishment for stepping outside of those rules, and there are these walls up between disciplines, and to cross over from one to the other may result in some kind of punishment, or worse in our case, not being published. And of course, this is now indoctrinated or brought into this in academia, meaning branch of instruction or department of knowledge. So I think it's interesting to kind of talk about the underlying connotations of this term, discipline, because really there is this kind of subversive idea that disciplines are very entrenched and not to be kind of, crossed between one or the other. And cross-examination is possibly a negative thing. Now, is this division really so bad? I mean, it's probably the most productive way to create our academic system. We have this entrenched set of rules. We have a more simple review process. We have experts in each field who are, the experts and can really train people in their discipline as well as provide feedback in the peer review process. It results in higher productivity. We can stand on the shoulders of those who came before us in our discipline and really dig deeper into that discipline. But what happens when this idea of discipline or this system of disciplines actually becomes repressive? What happens when we are afraid to step outside of the boundaries of our own disciplines for fear of being punished, or not being published, or for some other reason? Rules can lead to dogmatic ideals. So within our disciplines, if we strictly focus on our own disciplines, we may end up becoming quite defensive of our own ideas and our own knowledge. And researchers may be hesitant to stray from the currently accepted canon. So new researchers coming in who maybe want to step outside the box may be discouraged from doing so by the experts in the field. So this is why I'm making the case for cross-disciplinary research. This is a quotation from John Harris, who's an international development expert, and I can thank Craig for this quotation that I read. He included this in a reading in our first year development course. And it says, good scholarship must involve a tension between discipline and anti-discipline. One of the most fruitful ways of maintaining this tension is through a deep immersion into discipline combined with the constant subjecting of knowledge deriving from the discipline to that developed in others. In a sense, academic disciplines are saved from themselves by cross-disciplinarity. I really like this idea of disciplines being saved from themselves because one way to kind of avoid this entrenched dogmatic ideals is to subject the knowledge of each discipline to the knowledge and methods derived from other disciplines. Noam Chomsky said, I try to encourage people to think for themselves, to question standard assumptions, and begin by taking a skeptical attitude towards anything that is conventional wisdom. And I can infer from this that by conventional wisdom, he may mean that kind of set of rules or knowledge that we associate with each individual discipline. So what does this mean for health research? Cate just introduced epidemiology. Population medicine is my home department. And epidemiology is an extremely important tool for studying animal and human health. But when I came into this program, having a fairly good background in both social sciences and sciences, which may be the reason why it took 5 years instead of 4 years to finish my undergrad degree, I was trying to ask this question: what happens when we subject the tools in epidemiology and the knowledge in epidemiology to the eyes of researchers in other fields? And this program is kind of the perfect opportunity to do that because we have training in both the international development field, which provides us with a qualitative context, it provides us with a very strong theoretical background in international development, and then we have these courses in epidemiology, which are fairly quantitative focused courses looking at epidemiological models and methods. Just to really drive this point home, I want to point out that the Public Health Agency of Canada published a list of the determinants of health. Most of these determinants of health, or quite a few of them, are considered extremely important to epidemiology research and can be studied fairly well using quantitative methods. So in epidemiology, we certainly have branches of epidemiology that focus on qualitative work and focus on exploring the social determinants of health. But there is also a fairly traditional field of epidemiology, which includes mostly quantitative kind of work. So these are the determinants of health, which I kind of determined could fairly easily be studied using quantitative methods, including biology and income, education, physical environments, personal health practices, and gender. But if we focus only on these determinants of health, we really lose out on all these social determinants of health that possibly can be better studied using qualitative methods. So in order to get a full context, in order to really dive into health and epidemiology, we need to use methods derived from both the social sciences and the science fields. If we don't do this, we risk individualizing risk. And this is the idea that by looking only at the proximate causes of disease, we really miss out on the larger context. So rather than looking at the socially determined effects of disease, looking at macro level, by looking really only at the biological determinants of health or the quantifiable determinants of health, we risk creating a situation where we place the individual at risk, or the individual at fault for their own health and their own healthy choices. So when it comes to type 2 diabetes, we talk a lot about lifestyle choices, we talk a lot about diet, we talk a lot about physical activity and those kinds of things. By ignoring kind of the social context, the political context, and the cultural context within which these individuals are living, we tend to individualize their risk. And so we place them at blame for their own decisions in their lives. And really, this isn't the proper way to study health, especially when we're looking at developing countries where individuals are often entrenched within a cultural, political, or socioeconomic background, and they actually are not free to make their own choices. So the main point I want to make here with this introduction is that health is the result of a complex interplay between cultural, political, social, environmental, genetic, and biomedical factors. In order to study all of these factors that contribute to health, we really have to look at both quantitative and qualitative methods and subject the knowledge that we know from epidemiology to the knowledge we know from other disciplines. So let's dive into my doctoral research now. As I already mentioned, I'm in the collaborative program. The research problem I was looking at is fairly simple. Type 2 diabetes is on the rise in rural India, and I wanted to know why. What are the individual and societal risk factors contributing to type 2 diabetes in this Encheti region of Tamil Nadu, South India? This is a very small region of South India. It's located in northern Tamil Nadu, which is in the southeast corner. So for those of you who maybe don't have a scientific background, I'm just going to briefly describe what type 2 diabetes is before we get into the actual research. So with individuals with type 2 diabetes, their tissues are desensitized to the effects of insulin. Insulin is a hormone that's released into the bloodstream following a meal usually that results in tissues taking up glucose from the blood in order to use either as fuel immediately or to store as glycogen. So when someone is desensitized to the effects of insulin, their tissues no longer take up that glucose from the blood, and as a result, they experience these extreme fluctuations in their blood glucose levels over time. So this can lead to things like blindness, it can lead to cardiovascular disease, it can lead to peripheral circulation problems, which can lead to infections and eventually amputations, and that's why often individuals with very advanced diabetes have amputated limbs and fingers and toes. Also, eventually it can lead to disability and death if left entirely untreated. The good news is early detection and management techniques can drastically reduce such complications. So in developed countries, if you get sick with diabetes in Canada or the US, for example, and you're in your 30s, you can easily live a long and normal life with medication with proper management. What causes diabetes? It's super multifactorial. So we have genetic and lifestyle and dietary factors all kind of playing in with one another to create this situation that might be the perfect storm for an individual to develop diabetes. In epidemiology, we love to look at causal models. So this is kind of a basic causal model that I wanted to show you guys before we get into it, and we'll add to this as we go. But if we look at obesity, exercise, diet, genetics, they all play into the development of type 2 diabetes, and there's a lot of arrows between them as well because they're all kind of interrelated. So in rural South India, well, in India in general, type 2 diabetes is rising. Currently, or at least as of 2008, it was the prevalence of type 2 diabetes nationally was 8.7%. Likely it's gone up since then, although there's been no large-scale study since then. Typically, researchers have looked at type 2 diabetes and focused on urban areas because it was originally considered to be an issue of the urban population and of the elite population in India. But recent studies after 1990 especially have shown that there's been a massive increase in type 2 diabetes in rural areas as well. If we extended this graph, which only goes to 2005, on to 2015, we would see a huge spike in the last 10 years of rural diabetes, and in fact it's actually catching up to urban diabetes in a lot of places. So the big blue dot denotes the area where I was working, so it's northern Tamil Nadu, which is in the southeast corner of India. This is what it looks like in that area. It's in the foothills of the Western Ghats. Mainly farmland, agrarian land, low population density, possibly not what you would typically think when you think of India. It's a pretty beautiful area as well, so it was really nice to spend a lot of time there and enjoy the scenery and the nature as well. So I had two main research objectives when I went. The first was to examine qualitatively local knowledge, attitudes, and practices and perceptions surrounding changing diets and type 2 diabetes, and try and gain an understanding of the social context and political economy within which this epidemic, as it's being called by the WHO, was occurring. Second, I wanted to conduct a cross-sectional study, and this is really the epidemiological piece of my research, to determine the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in Encheti and examine which risk factors are associated with incident cases of type 2 diabetes. So this is what I'm going to be talking about mostly today, this second component. And this is the component that I haven't really presented yet and hasn't been published yet, but you guys are the fresh audience, so you guys get to listen to it. So we did a cross-sectional study. Essentially, a cross-sectional study is trying to take a cross-section of a population at a given moment in time. random sample of 753 adults from across 17 different villages, encompassing an area about 20 kilometers by 10 kilometers. We did an oral glucose tolerance test to test for type 2 diabetes, which is when you collect a blood sample at the end of a fasting period of 8 hours, and then you feed the individual a 75-gram glucose load, and then you wait 2 hours and take another blood sample. And depending on the different levels of those two blood samples, the different levels of blood glucose within those two samples, you can determine if an individual is either impaired fasting glucose, impaired glucose tolerance, and those things together are called prediabetes and mean an individual is at increased risk of developing diabetes in the future. We can also determine if they are diabetic, or we can determine if they're normal. We also collected information on descriptive characteristics such as age, gender, physical activity using a WHO standardized questionnaire, diet using a food frequency questionnaire, which assesses an individual's diet over the course of a year, and has been developed and standardized for Tamil Nadu by the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation. Also socioeconomic status using a possession-based wealth index, which is used by the National Rural Health and Family Questionnaire that is handed out every 3 or 4 years in India. Also occupation and livelihood. So we collected as much information as we could so that we could analyze this information after and determine what the associations were between these risk factors or potential risk factors and an individual actually being at risk of developing diabetes or having diabetes. So we use regression analyses to do this, which is essentially what I just explained. We're just trying to determine associations here. So we can't determine causation necessarily. We can just determine whether something is associated with something else. In this case, that something was a risk factor or multiple risk factors, and the outcome variable was our type 2 diabetes. So I want to I just gave all the technical jargon and everything for the methods that we completed. I want to bring it back and make it a little bit more personal. I hired a research team of 5 individuals. Unfortunately, we don't actually have a photo of all of us together, but we had 2 nutritionists, we had a doctor, a nurse, and a local logistician as well. We would wake up at 4:30 every morning, in this place. So we lived in Enchetti, which is a town of about 5,000 individuals, about 10,000, a population of around 10,000. We all lived together, so we would wake up early in the morning, we'd hop on our motorcycles and we'd drive on these kinds of roads out to whatever our sample site was for the day. We'd get there before people went into their fields for the day, which was typically around 5 or 5:30. We would arrive in a village. We would do our sampling, we would do our oral glucose tolerance test, and we'd be home by around noon. This is kind of what it looked like in the countryside around where we were doing our sampling. So mostly agricultural land. They're growing a combination of both cash crops, including tomatoes and groundnuts, as well as traditional crops. So in this case, this is a sorghum crop that you can kind of see in the foreground, which is a type of millet. This is a photo of one of the nutritionists that worked on the project, conducting a food frequency questionnaire with one of our participants. So getting right into the results. I came home, did about 3 or 4 months of data entry, and started actually looking at the numbers. And what I found was a very, very high prevalence of both prediabetes and diabetes in the research site. So we had 9% diabetes and 11.7% crude rate, prevalence rate of type 2 diabetes. When we standardized that against the census data for Tamil Nadu, we had a prevalence rate overall of 10.3%. You might ask if that is really that high. Yeah, it's pretty high. In Canada, we have a prevalence rate of 6.6%. In the US, which is considered, to most people at least, one of the diabetes capitals of the world, is 9.3% prevalence rate. Mexico is higher than that. And I don't know if you're up on health news, Mexico has one of the highest rates of diabetes in the world, aside from some of the Polynesian islands. So a 10.3% prevalence rate is extremely high, especially for a rural area. So after we did our regression analyses, I'm just going to show the results of one of them here. we looked at, we basically inputted 60 different variables and analyzed them against their associations with type 2 diabetes and with prediabetes. And when we made this huge multivariate model, we ended up with these risk factors staying in the model and being significantly associated with either prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. So physical activity, a lot of them are kind of intuitive. They were what we expected. Physical activity is associated with lower risk, for example, of both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So is polyunsaturated fat consumption, which was a bit of a surprise, but I'm not going to get into that too much today. Family history of diabetes, so this is kind of a proxy for genetics, was associated with prediabetes. Odds ratio of 2.85, which means an individual with a family history of diabetes was 2.85 times more likely to also have prediabetes. Body mass index and waist to hip ratio are both different measures of essentially how obese or overweight an individual is. Tobacco consumption has been known to be associated with type 2 diabetes for a long time, so this was no surprise. But I've censored out the last one here to add a certain amount of suspense, because we're going to go in and talk about that last one, which was kind of the most interesting, especially from a development perspective. To me, the most interesting risk factor that was associated with both prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, even stronger than most of those other factors that we're looking at there. So this is a map of the area, and Cate is the red dot with the arrow pointing to it that says Anchetti. And basically we sampled all these villages that were kind of radiating out from the central village of Anchetti. And the size of the dots is related to the prevalence of diabetes in that village. And when I was doing the research, I kind of started to pick up on this pretty soon into the research. We were working from as far away from Anchetti, and then started gradually working our way in as the research went on. And with every village that we went in, it seemed like I was getting more and more diabetics. But it wasn't until I actually started looking at this data that I realized that this is what was happening. And it was pretty shocking to me how the further you got away from Anchetti, the less diabetes was an issue, and the closer you got, similarly, the more it was an issue. So I started thinking, well, this idea of how rural, because this entire area is classified as rural by the Census Bureau of India. So I started thinking that somebody must have looked at this before. Somebody must have gone in, done an epidemiological study, and noticed in rural areas, or similarly in urban areas, that there is this continuum depending on how close or far you are from an urban center or a metropolitan center, or even just a town. Someone must have figured out this association before. But in fact, when I went to the literature and I started searching for this, and I've read hundreds of articles on type 2 diabetes in India over the course of my PhD, and nobody has ever tried to quantify this. I'm looking at it as kind of a continuum of rurality. So the closer you are, the further you are from a town center, the more rural you are, the closer you are, the less rural you are. But in epidemiology literature, when people look at this idea of urbanization and how urbanization might impact somebody's risk of developing diabetes, all they do is they take a sample from an urban area, they take a sample from a rural area, they don't define what urban means, they don't define what rural means, they just compare the two samples and say, well, urban sample has a higher prevalence rate of diabetes, therefore urbanization must be associated with type 2 diabetes. And that's not untrue, but it loses so much of the nuance that you might otherwise see if you're looking at things in the way that I was trying to look at things. Just to show that again, to emphasize the point. That's extremely rural, and that's somewhat less rural, and we see a very, very clear continuum there of how common type 2 diabetes is. So it started to get me thinking, well, what is rural exactly? How do we qualify it? How do we quantify it? And it's not really a question that's asked all that often in epidemiology. In my mind, it's some combination of population density, lack of industry, occupation, potentially a certain percentage of individuals affiliated with agriculture, isolation, so social or familial connections, access to services, goods, and markets, these kinds of things, right? And I started to think, well, maybe I'm the first person to be thinking about this within epidemiology, and it got me kind of excited about this idea that I was maybe coming up with something somewhat original. The idea that we can go deeper into this idea of how rural an individual is and look at it in terms of their chronic disease risk, and maybe come up with something that's really interesting and new. And what I was failing to do is I was failing to look outside of epidemiology for this kind of information. I was failing to look at theory from elsewhere to explain what I was seeing. And once I started to do that, I realized we can't have original thoughts. Everything's been thought before by somebody in some discipline. It's just that there are these walls up potentially around our discipline, and we haven't yet cherry-picked these ideas from other disciplines and brought them into our own research, our own discipline. And this really proved to me that kind of what I was talking about in the beginning. So once I started looking into the sociology literature, the international development literature, I realized, yeah, I mean, this has been thought, this is a thought that's been thought before, essentially. So as this publication in 2011 states, the urbanization of the world is a kind of exteriorization of the inside as well as an interiorization of the outside. The urban unfolds into the countryside just as the countryside folds back into the city. Rural places have become an integral part of post-industrial production, swallowed up by an urban fabric, ceaselessly corroding the residue of agrarian life, gobbling up everything and everywhere in order to increase surplus value and accumulate capital. And this may sound a bit hyperbolic, and it may make an urban center sound a little bit like a monster tramping around the countryside, destroying this romantic way of life. But what I want you to get from that, and what I kind of got from this, is this idea that urban centers and rural centers, now more than ever, are less disconnected than ever. And this idea that when we dichotomize rural and we dichotomize urban, we really lose out on so much of the context and so much of the nuance that actually comes within those categories themselves. So the main point, excuse me, dichotomizing urban and rural isn't the best way to model urbanization. As Sayer says in 1992, it divides the indivisible and lumps together the unrelated and the inessential, thereby carving up the object of study with little or no regard for its structure and form. Both of these categories, urban and rural, are generalized to the point of meaninglessness. So the main point I kind of want to drive home, if you haven't already gotten it, is that rural communities in developing countries are not as isolated as we might believe. There is so much happening that we miss out on if we dichotomize and really consider rural as just one large category. For example, there's seasonal migration. There are plenty of people, I'm sure, in this room who've studied seasonal migration, individuals moving from a rural area to an urban area and back again, and probably taking back with them different foods, different cultural norms, different ideas, all these kinds of things. Technology, pretty much every household I went into in India had a television. They have access to programming which has been created in an urban area, so that urban culture is beamed directly into rural households. Also infiltration of markets. I mean, people are eating urban foods. If you call packaged processed foods urban foods, rural people now have access to that like everywhere in the world essentially. Also, there's this idea of urbanization of rural areas. I mean, urbanization typically and traditionally has meant the movement of individuals from a rural area into an urban area. So there's this idea of like, an hourglass, and for one grain of sand that moves out of one category, it moves into the other category. When in fact, rural areas are just becoming increasingly more like urban areas as time progresses. And that's an idea that I think has been lost in a lot of health science research, especially in developing countries. So how can we study this using epidemiological tools? Well, if we consider epidemiological tools, it's just very difficult. There's just so much nuance that is really difficult to capture using quantitative epidemiological tools that you have to go to qualitative epidemiological tools, and you have to go to qualitative tools from other areas and other disciplines. Also, spending a long time in a research community before beginning a research project is crucial. I spent 6 months before even doing this research, and through that time and that investment, I really gained an understanding of what I was going to be looking at. I gained an understanding of the language that was being used to communicate different concepts. I tried to gain an understanding of, and gaining trust in the communities as well. All these kinds of things are very crucial for conducting good epidemiological research. And rather than diving in, grabbing the data and diving out, it's much more productive to go in for a long period of time. Also, collecting a lot of data. You really never know what you're going to find once you start analyzing your data. You don't want to get to a point where you say, I wish I just asked this question. So you really want to try and collect as much data as you possibly can while you're there. And try not to simplify complex associations. We do have a tendency when we're doing quantitative analyses to try to categorize everything, to try to dichotomize everything. But we really miss out on a lot of the complex nuances when we do that. One way to try not to dichotomize or categorize everything is to create an index for something. So indices are a continuous variable that can capture a continuum. And this is what I tried to do with this idea of rurality. I didn't have that much data on what makes a rural household, but something that I did have was their distance to the market town and the population of the village in which they lived. And I thought maybe if I combine these two things in some way, I can create some kind of index that can be analyzed as a continuous variable. So I took the distance that an individual lived to the market, subtracted the population of the home village, and divided it all by the standard deviation of those two things. I created an index. It's not that difficult to do, and it's probably still an oversimplification. It's not probably, it definitely is still an oversimplification. But it's the best I kind of could do with the data that I had. And that's the black box that I censored out. So the rurality index ended up being extremely significantly associated both with prediabetes and with type 2 diabetes. And in both cases, they were negatively associated. So essentially, the more rural an individual was, according to the rurality index, the less likely they were to have diabetes. Because the index is really hard to actually kind of assess in any meaningful way and bring back to kind of practical reality, I kind of picked it apart again and made it a little more clear. So this means essentially that for every 10 kilometers a household is away from the market town, their odds of having type 2 diabetes decreases by 2.1 times, and odds of having prediabetes decreases by 2.2 times. Also, for every 100 people that live in that home village, their odds of having type 2 diabetes increase by 1.2 times, and odds of having prediabetes increases by 1.2 times. So it's a very clear and significant association that we see here, and in my mind is extremely interesting. Unfortunately, where a person is born and where they live isn't directly associated with type 2 diabetes. We know just because somebody lives in this location, they're not automatically at higher risk of developing diabetes. There's some kind of more proximate risk factors that are being, that rurality is affecting, which then affects type 2 diabetes, right? Because we know that the only proximate risk factors for type 2 diabetes essentially are obesity, physical activity, genetics, and diet. I mean, there's a few others, but essentially we know that rurality is not directly associated with type 2 diabetes. There must be something there that is an intervening factor or that's in the middle. So it's essentially this black box. We don't really know what it is, and in research it's really hard to illuminate using quantitative methods. So how do we illuminate it? We use qualitative research. And that was kind of, it's funny because I did it in somewhat reverse order, but I went back then and started looking again at the data that I collected during that first study that I did, where I was looking at local knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions, and trying to bring in all this qualitative data into what I was looking at and what I was seeing with respect to this rurality index. And what you end up with is something that looks like this when you look just at the quantitative kind of data, and something that looks like this when you, oh, hold on. There we go, I think that's it. When you look at everything else. So you see there are so many factors associated, and you see just how much context there is. I mean, this isn't even a fraction of it. These are just the ones I could fit on the page to make a point. But essentially, you have everything from rising demand for cash crops in urban areas, which impacts rural areas and what they're growing and then what they're consuming. You have declining forest cover due to growing populations in rural areas themselves, which in turn leads to dietary change because individuals are no longer dependent on wild meat or wild vegetables. You have all these things, and when you start looking at it like this, it just becomes so extremely complicated, and you wonder, how do you even really study anything with respect to this? And I don't really have an answer for that, actually. It's just really important that we look at everything that could potentially impact an individual's health when we're examining these types of issues, and that's the main point I want to make. So, how is this useful? Well, for one, I hope that after this you kind of understand how important it is to have a rich context behind each research problem that you're examining throughout your own research, whether it's master's, PhD, or above that. It's important that we increase the trust of research communities prior to any kind of quantitative study. This is something that I realized time and time again, that trust was so crucial to me actually collecting quality data. It's crucial to gain a better understanding of the meaning and implications of quantitative findings by going to qualitative data, by being a social epidemiologist, by using focus groups, using interviews, and gaining this rich context. The qualitative data can also inform quantitative methods beforehand or afterwards as well. So the rurality index is kind of a perfect example of that. Also, something I didn't touch on quite as much is development of a food frequency questionnaire and knowing what foods people were eating before I actually conducted the questionnaire. Familiarizing yourself with local terminology. I had no idea before I went into India that everybody in this area of Tamil Nadu calls diabetes the sugar disease. And if I had just been asking everyone, do you have diabetes, or asking questions surrounding diabetes and using that term, nobody would have understood what I was saying, and I would have gotten zero data. Surprisingly, it took me about 2 or 3 weeks to even realize that. So if you're diving in without spending any time in a place beforehand, you're likely going to miss those kinds of opportunities. Also, just to contextualize and localize the application and the recommendations of your work. Realize that likely your work is somewhat transferable to other locations, but also recognize that there may be a certain amount of just locality to your results as well. Unfortunately, I've been projecting this idea that cross-disciplinary research is the next best thing, and it's amazing, but there are a few caveats to it. Definitely funding agencies and universities are catching on to the idea of cross-disciplinary research as being a very positive thing. Perfect example is the program that me and a few other students are currently in that combines international development and epidemiology, two fields of study that traditionally haven't really crossed over too much, but definitely makes sense in terms of trying to transfer and share knowledge. But it can be difficult to get things published. The journals have been somewhat slower to adopt this idea of cross-disciplinary research. So I've had to actually break up all of my data into these manageable chunks that can be published either in epidemiology or in social sciences. It can also be difficult to work with researchers from different disciplines. There are many examples through my field research where my ideas conflicted with individuals from different disciplines. And I can think of several examples outside of myself as well that I know from other people who've had similar issues. Yeah, so I mean, my only advice really is that design research in a way that can be manageably broken up until the journals actually catch up to us. And hopefully over time cross-disciplinary research will become the new norm wherever it's appropriate and wherever it increases the quality of our research. So just to conclude, now we all know that type 2 diabetes is a growing health concern in rural India. We know that there's a lot of factors at play behind this. We know that cross-disciplinary research can allow us to subject knowledge from one discipline to that of another, therefore broadening our understanding. And both quantitative and qualitative research is necessary in epidemiological research and in international development research for the development of long-term preventive and management solutions for chronic diseases, as well as many, many issues in the field of health. Thanks to everyone for for listening, and thanks to Dr. Sally Humphries and Cate Dewey for being my wonderful supervisors, and everyone else for assisting in the field. And yeah, that's it for my talk. So thanks for listening.
That wonderfully energetic and enthusiastic and comprehensive.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really a discussion, I think, really illuminating for everybody here. Yeah, now you understand why I was so happy that he crossed my threshold all those years ago. Questions from people?
Yeah.
I found that was really cool, the rural to urban thing, as I'm sure you do because you emphasize it. I was just wondering if you tried modeling the villages separately, even just to see if the determinants and the magnitude of determinants changed, or like predictors, factors. I don't know which.
The main issue with doing that, I didn't do that. The main issue with doing that is because I had such a low sample size within each village.
Yeah, it's more just for like anecdotally to see
Right.
if things matter more by place.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I haven't done that yet. Yeah, as I said, like, you know, some of the villages, and it is hard to, like, you know, I throw that map up on the screen, but, you know, some of those villages, because they have such low populations, I collected like 10 samples from, you know, so it's like pretty difficult to make these overarching conclusions, and especially when looking at, I guess for anecdotal evidence it'd be interesting, but it's not really, it wouldn't be epidemiologically relevant.
No. It's more, I come from a geography background.
Right.
So geography does do the spatial modeling. So you said
Right.
if you want to do this, you need big data.
Yeah.
Or like lots of data. And so it's interesting because we're starting to just look at, just let's say we throw out sample size, significant in power, and just see what's
going
data
on.
Says. It's just sort of interesting and can help with the qualitative.
Yeah. I mean, I have tons of experience with that, just like off the top of my head without actually doing the analysis on stuff. I could probably tell you, for example, you know, some of the villages are high caste villages, they're Brahmin villages. Brahmin villages, or Brahmin caste they're vegetarian, they're strict vegetarians. They have a higher sugar consumption because they spend a lot of time in the temple and giving like sugary treats to, like, there's just like all these different dietary kind of restrictions on Brahmins that result in them having a much higher sugar intake and a much lower protein intake often, protein and vegetable and stuff like that. So as a result, like, there are, you know, those kinds of risk factors, and like there's dozens of those kinds of little anecdotal stories from different places, but they're not as relevant, I guess, to the overall like epidemiological significance of everything, because I just can't make broad conclusions on like such a small sample size, you know. Yeah.
Out of interest, how did you get everyone to agree to spend so much time? Like for the glucose testing, you said it takes 2 hours, right? So did you warn them in advance that you were coming, or how did you get them to buy into?
Yeah, so I said that we would go out every morning and every evening. In the evening, we would do all our recruiting, and we would collect as much information as we could from those people who agreed, in terms of like doing the questionnaires with them beforehand, or at least doing part of the questionnaires. And then we would tell them we were coming back the following morning. And we had a fairly high response rate from women. It was like 98% from women, and it was about 87 from men. So there's a number of reasons for that. The overall high response rate was due to the fact, I think, that we were offering more than just what you see here. We were offering like a checkup with a doctor, basically. So they were getting their blood hemoglobin levels tested as well. They were getting their blood sugar tested. They were having all this stuff, and like, you know, those kinds of checkups are fairly valuable in those communities, because otherwise they have to travel, likely by bus, like upwards of 10, 15 kilometers in many cases to get to the clinic, and take a day off work because the lines are so long. So like the fact we were going there and willing to do a health checkup with these people meant that our response rate was fairly high, and that's how we kind of sold it on people often. But yeah, it was still an issue in some cases with follow-up. Like they needed to stay stationary throughout those 2 hours, and often we'd like go back to their house and their, significant other or son would be like, oh, he went out to the field. And so it would be like, we have 5 minutes to go and find him to get this, like, to be on schedule. So we'd like run out through the fields with our blood testing equipment and like find them. And like, those are the kinds of things, like obviously that's not ideal from like a consistence perspective for doing epidemiology research. But anyone who's done field work will tell you that like you have to take those kinds of errors or that kind of bias, I guess, in stride when you're doing field research, because you just have to be very, very flexible. And we still got good data despite it all, so I guess it worked out. Yeah.
Since you look at this health issue from a whole bunch of different angles, what do you think are the most important things that need to change to improve this situation?
There's so much that I didn't go into. So, as I said, like, I spent a lot of time looking at rurality in this presentation, when in fact, like, that's just a distal kind of factor of the disease, and there's so many proximate factors of the disease that are probably more significant for actually like public health programming and stuff like that. So, for one, there needs to be an emphasis on physical activity is a tough one because individuals who work in fields are so physically active, or do labor work are so physically active, and so it's hard to like promote physical activity on top of that. Diet is one area I think that could be definitely addressed in terms of public health programming. There's not as much like public health education programming about dietary diseases such as diabetes that promote a healthy, kind of more balanced diet. And for example, there's a public distribution system of white polished rice that provides white polished rice, palm oil, and sugar to like, in Tamil Nadu, it's a huge number of families. Completely free. Everyone below the poverty line is permitted to access like 25 kilograms of rice, and as well as a ration of sugar and oil. And if you think about that, like sugar, rice, and oil, that's not exactly the best diet to be consuming if you want to be avoiding type 2 diabetes, especially when there's a genetic predisposition there and everything. And that rice is so polished because it's been stored for such a long time. In order to increase the storability of it, they remove the husk, which contains all the fiber. So it's like basically eating pure sugar, kind of. And that promotes this diet that is, shifting away from a traditional diet. So that's like, I would say that's number one in terms of addressing the issue of type 2 diabetes, is look at that public distribution system, look at the dietary shifts that it's causing, and try to address those in a way that promotes a healthy shift back to a diet that would be less glucogenic, it's called. So a diet that doesn't have such a high glucose load. Yeah. There's tons of other stuff though that you could do. I could go on. Yeah.
Just getting back to your conversation of cross-disciplinary studies and sort of to, I guess, quarter and all accomplish that. But in terms of the One Health movement was very popular, and I haven't really been following it. I think it's kind of fizzled out there just because of the requiring people to outside the silos.
Yeah.
Cross-disciplinary, which is tough.
Mm-hmm.
Have you encountered that as a concept that would promote IDR work? Because presumably, not just diabetes, but some of the risk factors and things that we'd be looking at would translate to multiple other diseases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Issues.
Mm-hmm. One Health is still, it's survived as a concept. There are several researchers in the population medicine department who focus their efforts on One Health or ecosystems approaches to health, which is a very similar kind of paradigm. I'm not necessarily an expert on either of those, but they definitely fit with the whole cross-disciplinary, kind of thesis of the presentation I gave today. In terms of addressing maybe why they haven't caught on as much as they have, it's difficult for me to say, but I just think cross-disciplinary research in general is very, very difficult to implement in practice. When you're dealing with people who are from a different discipline and have different, aims and goals as you do, and you're trying to work within this academic funding period of 4 years to get something done, it can just be very, very challenging. And it's something that we experienced on the project in India. It's something I know that several other people I know who've been involved with these types of projects have had difficulty with. And yeah, I think that funding agencies jump on the chance to fund these types of projects now, but they're limited in their success sometimes by some intra-project kind of disagreements, I guess. So it's challenging. It's definitely challenging. But I hope that there's kind of a new generation of researchers coming along as well who are much more willing to do this type of work. And I feel like my generation of researchers and the generation even above me is much more willing to step outside of their commonly accepted, paradigm and their discipline and go over to that other department and chat with them about what they're doing. I don't know. It's hard for me to say, but hopefully in the future we'll see a resurgence of the One Health movement because it is great. Yeah, Craig.
Well, thanks, Matt. This is a fascinating topic and a great presentation. Just want to follow up on David's previous question about the public distribution system. And there, I think it highlights the possibility that there's obviously competing policy objectives on the part of the Canadian government. With the public distribution system, in its best light, it's providing low-cost essential staples and commodities to the poor. In its worst light, it's siphoning off surplus from Indian agriculture. I'm wondering then, in light of that, thinking about perhaps the officials that you might have been working with or talking to what degree is type 2 diabetes recognized as a problem among the populations, among government officials? Or is it something that's perhaps of lower priority right now than starvation deaths or malnutrition? Where is it ranked?
Depends where you are in India. Definitely in rural areas, it's being overlooked. Mainly because there are so many other issues with communicable diseases, with undernutrition, with malnutrition, with poverty that need to be addressed and are given higher priority over issues like obesity and type 2 diabetes. So I don't foresee any kind of national change in the public distribution system on a huge scale at any point soon. I know that there have been some trial projects looking at introducing millets into the scheme, and I think that they've actually gone ahead with that in a few states. But I don't think there's enough supply of healthy grains in India to actually implement that on a large scale. Unless we decrease storage time of rice and we start to, increase the accessibility to healthier rices that are less processed. In terms of from the medical kind of perspective, it's also overlooked, I think, in terms of the local medical system. Technically, it's not even in the mandate of PHCs, the primary healthcare centers, to deal with type 2 diabetes. They can actually refuse to treat type 2 diabetic patients and send them to a secondary, or send them to the level up, which would only be in larger towns. Where I was, there was only a PHC, and then you would have to have traveled about 30 kilometers to get to the next level up of a healthcare center. They were dealing with diabetes patients, but it's not technically even in their mandate to do that. So clearly there is this oversight, I think, of this issue in rural areas. And I also think that it's just where I was working was considerably higher prevalence rates than a lot of other places in India. Tamil Nadu specifically is fairly notorious for having high rural prevalence rates. And there's been several other studies that have shown prevalence rates similar to mine. But if you go to the north or you go elsewhere, they're not nearly as high. So I think it's being overseen at the national level as a result because it's seen as a localized problem. So all of those things combine to make it a fairly low priority issue, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Hasana from Nepal, and I also work in the same project from New York.
Oh, yeah.
And for the last 8 months, I worked in Philip in Winnipeg, and most of the time he gave you reference like Nathan has did a excellent job in Tamil Nadu.
Yeah.
In these projects, and then he was giving lots of citation and all these things from you. And I'm really happy that now I'm here, like listening to you. Like it's really a privilege for me. It is really awesome job. Thank you for that. And only one question from my side. Last month I also conducted this food security survey in Nepal, and I had to take information on the diet, consumption rate. It's very difficult. And I had to take for 7 days, but they were not recalling that bad recalling that days.
Yeah.
And lastly I narrowed down for 3 days and took the data.
Yeah.
Just I'm curious to know that how you manage to take those data.
Yeah.
That is the one, and another is like in India and even in Nepal, it's like a seasonal food habits. What they grow, they consume. It's not like they buy and they consume. And it's like we have 3 seasons, main 3 seasons, and different crops, and we consume differently. And one season data will not give the for the whole year around like analysis.
Yeah.
Then how you manage like by doing this?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. So I worked with the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation, and they developed a research tool called, it's a food frequency questionnaire. And what that is it's a questionnaire. It also has this atlas that they published with it that has pictures of different portion sizes of all of the different possible dishes, okay? And so you go to a household or you go to an individual that you're conducting a survey with, you say, and I have a list of about 250 foods, all dishes or fruits or drinks, stuff like that. Basically everything that an individual could possibly consume is on this list, right? And we go through it one by one, and we say, do you eat, do you eat papayas? And they say, yeah, I eat papayas. Like, how many times per day, week, month, or year do you eat papayas? And they say, oh, I eat papayas 3 times a month. And so we write that down, and we just tick the box for that. And then we collect seasonal information on the fruits as well. So we have like all of our list of fruits has seasonal information where we multiply like what they say. If they say, oh, I eat it like 2 times a day when it's in season, and we know that the season is 3 months long, we do the math and figure that out. They've also, so the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation developed this research tool, and then they also developed software to go with it, where you just enter in all the numbers and it does all the calculations for you, essentially. And what they've done to develop this software is they've made all these dishes, and then they've done a lab analysis on the exact nutritional content of every single one of those dishes. And then they feed that into the software program so that when you input something into it, it comes out on the other side as being, on average, what they eat every day for like an entire year, essentially. So on average, how many calories they eat per day, how many carbohydrates, refined sugars, protein, like dietary fiber, insoluble dietary fiber, everything. There's like 100 different things, including micronutrients like iron and stuff like that. And so that was an extremely valuable tool for me. And it was really lengthy to begin with, but once you train, we actually went to the Madras Diabetes Research Foundation and had them train my research assistants. And once they were properly trained, they could get the time down to about 30 minutes where they were doing those questionnaires, which is still fairly long, but it collected really good data. So if you look up, if you're still doing this kind of work and you're interested in carrying on with it, if you start looking up food frequency questionnaires for India, and there may be one for Nepal as well, and you start looking at how they operate, you might be able to work with that type of a questionnaire as well, and it might be valuable for your research. I hope I explained it well. It's like kind of it's a lengthy like process to actually come up with the questionnaire, but in the end, we got really good data. Yeah,
Is that a household or individual?
it's an individual.
Okay. And was it validated in the population you work with?
It was validated with a different population in India by the organization themselves, and then I personally validated it by comparing it with 24-hour dietary recalls and also going back after a month to certain individuals, to like 20 households or to 20 individuals, and redoing it and trying to figure out like the correlation coefficient and stuff like that. And it was like, yeah, it was well validated within both of those methods that I used. Yeah.
I think we should probably
Wrap it up.
stop in a second. That was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much. Really.